Great, how is everybody doing? I got one woo. No, this is a fantastic day. Thank you all for coming here. This really is an incredible moment in York's history. So thank everyone for being here, and this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Being a tech startup guy, raising capital is incredibly difficult, especially in a place like York. So this is going to be an exciting panel that I've been looking forward to. So this is the venture panel for venture perspectives on talent and scaling tech companies in the heartland. So I'd like you to give it up. A warm reception is going to be moderated by Patrick McKenna, the founder of High Ridge Venture Partners. It's going to be Les Craig, a partner at Next Frontier Capital, Anna Mason, who is a good friend of York, who is a partner at Rise of the Rest, Seed Fund and Revolution, and Charles Szrom, investment manager at Verizon Ventures. Please give it up.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Room on the couch.
All right. Hopefully everybody had enough cupcakes to give them 20 minutes of good energy. Oh, we want 3 on the couch. Excellent. Well, terrific. Well, that's excellent. I'm Patrick McKenna, founder and partner of High Ridge Venture Partners. Really happy to be here with you all today. Our panel is, I'd like to read it, Venture Perspectives on Talent and Scaling in the Heartland. And we add the and challenges, threats, and opportunities from automation and robotics. 20 minutes go. Right, this is a big topic. And so I would like to just start by maybe each of you just giving the quick 30 seconds of your firm's thesis and your personal connection to the Heartland.
Awesome. So once again, my name is Les Craig. I'm with Next Frontier Capital. We're based out of Bozeman, Montana. And our firm's investment thesis is to provide access to capital to early stage tech companies in the Northern Rocky Mountains. And I typically define Northern Rockies as if you can ski it in May, it's a place we'll probably do a deal. Actually my tie to the Heartland, I'm a Pennsylvania native.
Right.
I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, and one of the highlights of my childhood was always coming to York, Pennsylvania to visit my aunt and uncle on summer vacations. So, yeah.
Yeah, just really up to the crowd here, yeah.
So my grandpa was from Erie, but I grew up in Northwest Indiana, about an hour outside Chicago, steel-making center of the country. So that's my heartland tie, very similar manufacturing area, much like York. On firm thesis, work for Verizon Ventures, which is the corporate venture capital arm of Verizon. So our thesis is to invest in the strategic future of connectivity, firms that enable either the infrastructure or ecosystem of the next generation of connectivity that Verizon is building.
And with the Rise of the Rest Fund, I think foundationally we see opportunity through the lens of geography. How that translates is that whereas 75% of the venture capital that gets invested across the entire industry, it was about plus minus 100 billion in capital last year, depending on who you ask. 75% of that goes to 3 places: Northern California, New York City, and Boston. And we believe very, very strongly that they're phenomenal entrepreneurs, literally building and reimagining the future all across the country, and that there's really great talent distributed everywhere. And right now, because of that geographic concentration and availability of capital, opportunity is not as evenly distributed as talent is. So our investment thesis is to try to do our part to redistribute that opportunity by exclusively investing our venture capital into every place else all across the country. So we are about 15 months into our Rise of the Rest Fund, which is the earliest stage fund under the broader Revolution umbrella. And we have just over 115 companies where we're invested across 60 cities in the country. My connection to the Heartland and to York and central Pennsylvania is that I'm delighted to be back here, I guess about a year and a half after we brought our Rise of the Rest tour through York and central Pennsylvania in October 2017. So it was great to catch up with many friends and former tour partners. But we take a sort of crazy red tour bus through different places in the country once a year. We do 5 cities in 5 days. And through my work leading that effort, I've had the opportunity to personally visit over 30 cities all across the country in the past 3 years. As a tour, we've been to 38 cities. And it's just been such a special way, I think, to get to know true visionaries building the future all across the country.
Thank you. I don't have a direct connection to York, except for as an investor, I've invested in 4 companies in Baltimore, and I drove here in like 45 minutes this morning from Baltimore. So I feel I had to put something into this thing here. Anna, could you share a little bit more about your, the year-over-year experience? Now, you've been on the bus, you've been to tons of communities. This is a unique opportunity that 15 months ago, you were right here in this town, and I know after lunch you went and spent a little time with some of the people that you met a year ago. Could you just share a little bit how they're doing with scaling and bringing talent and making progress against the thesis that you saw?
Yeah, I think one of John McElligott from York Exponential, who was just out here, was one of the first people that I had the privilege of connecting to when we were first getting to know the community and the ecosystem here, not only in York, but in Lancaster and Harrisburg as well. We actually met through Rodney Sampson, who may or may not have been up on the stage already from OHUB. We met at South by, and John and his team at York Exponential, I think, are approaching this challenge of the future of automation, robotics, and workforce development and challenges more broadly, really head on, and leaning into the true industrial roots and manufacturing roots of the community and the ecosystem here, and using that legacy sort of backyard industry expertise to not only play a part of, but aim to take a leading role in the future of robotics and manufacturing and workforce development. And it was exciting for me to be back here a year and a half later and to see the real progress that's happened. And hats off to John and his team when we came through with Rise the Rest. The building was literally under development, and there were like sheets hanging up everywhere, and we got to see a lot of whiteboarding and I think an early prototype of one of the robots. And fast forward to earlier this afternoon, we had the opportunity to meet with, I think it was maybe 25 or 30 people on the team, if not more, get to demo, I think, half a dozen different applications that are actually in progress right now with real clients all across the country. So it was exciting to see that progress in real time a year and a half later.
That's terrific. That does show how fascinating it happened, and the connections that are made through events like this and others. I felt progress is so important to connect people together in these ideas and these assets. So Les, you started in Baltimore with Red Owl, that sold, and then you take us all the way across the country to Montana. Yep. And now we're talking small towns, very rural. And can you talk a little bit about the impact that the tech ecosystem, tech jobs is having on Montana at a more macro level?
Absolutely. So I moved to Montana in 2015, and it was interesting. At that time, the average amount of venture capital invested in the state annually, it typically averaged around $2 to $3 million a year. There's occasionally outlier years, but that was generally what you saw as kind of a cadence. Our firm closed the first fund in 2015. That was a $21 million fund, made 9 investments over the course of about 2 years in Montana-based companies. And what we saw in 2017 was $83 million of venture capital coming into the state. To date, we've noted kind of a ratio of about $7 from outside the state that's coming in for every dollar that we've invested in the state. And that's great, but what's most significant about that is what it's led to in terms of growth in the tech industry. So for the first time in 2017, the Montana High-Tech Business Alliance reported that revenues from Montana tech businesses surpassed $1 billion for the first time ever. And the rate of growth of that industry is about 9 times the more traditional agriculture and tourism industries, which are kind of the leaders in the economic sector in Montana. This past year, 2018, Montana tech companies reported $2 billion in annual revenue, so essentially doubled in a year. And so once again, that growth rate is about 9 times the state average in terms of growth.
And we're going to get back to what Montana is doing right in a second, because that is, I think, a lot of people are probably interested in hearing about that trajectory. And I know Rise of the Rest actually made their first investment in Montana recently, so that's also exciting. And Charlie, can you talk about, you guys look more macro across the whole country, can you talk about the overall trends? I mean, there's some positive things happening in pockets, but you might have a mixed view of the trends and it's maybe not evenly distributed.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think it's an important point. I think, Les and I were talking before about, on a per capita basis, the strides that Montana has made, looking at the numbers, if you look at rough pitch trip data, don't quote me on this, but you look at Indiana, which I mentioned before, it's gone from about 40 or so VC dollars per head to maybe about 56 between 2014 and 2018, last 4 or 5 years or so. So impressive growth, right? California has gone from something like $1,000 to $1,600 a head, so it's massive, right? So there's slightly more dollars being invested in the heartland, but on the scale relative to California or New York, which is where the amount of capital is more than doubled between 2014 and 2018, it's not keeping as much pace. So it's a great story and the progress that's been made. But I think the point here is there's so much more work to be done. So we've come a long way, but there's so much more to go, and we can get into some of those challenges. But I think, as an investor in the space, we've started to see companies that specialize. I think one of the earlier panels was talking about what I guess is now the sort of off-mentioned example of ExactTarget in Indianapolis, right? Creating an ecosystem there around SaaS. So there's important stories of creating these pools of talent, right? Where historically you maybe had too many sort of seed kind of earlier stage companies doing something a similar thing. Now there's more synergy, folks getting together, say, okay, we got a vertical SaaS person here, go to market, back end designer, and everyone sort of comes together in the same place and creates a little ecosystem. So that's starting to happen in places like Indy. Pittsburgh is often mentioned with transportation. So more of that needs to happen. And from an investor point of view, we also like to see more and diverse series of syndicates come together and invest in these places. So it's not just one venture capitalist coming in for the seed round, but it's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 coming in to create these A, B rounds that allow the company to really scale to national and global levels.
So I have another statistic to add to that I think speaks to the power and the importance of diversified syndicates. And while the investment per capita is definitely not jumping quite as much as we would like in the heartland relative to the coasts, here's a statistic that has me heartened and optimistic about the direction where we're headed. So a couple years ago, I think 2015, the percentage of seed deals where the venture firm was investing outside of its headquarter location or its hometown was 42%. Today, it's 59%. And so I think that shows, while the headline numbers are not necessarily shifting all that much in the aggregate in terms of investment capital moving and diversifying away from the coasts to the rest of the countries, I do think in particular at the early stages, we're definitely starting to see momentum building around, I think not just coastal investors, but us co-investing with one another all across the country and continuing to build those great pockets of access that then lead to not only capital, but opportunity and the ability for our portfolio companies to level up.
And maybe the important point is it doesn't need to be a dichotomy either, right? Both can grow together,
Yep.
right? And I think that what was mentioned before, it doesn't need to be another Silicon Valley. It can be its own success in its own right with their own talents.
Yet the willingness of kind of, like you say, 70% of the venture is sitting in Silicon Valley, the willingness to invest outside of their area. I mean, just down here in Baltimore, August Capital put $5 million into a company. Sequoia put some money into a company that we're familiar with. Like, that is a big reach, and that trend is now getting them exposed to the market and seeing new entrepreneurs. Anna, you have this theory of ecosystems, right? Like we were kind of talking about here. And could you give an example of what you mean by how important the ecosystem is and how to finding a company and also how it scales?
Sure. So through the work that we do, we get to, it's neat, we get to both experience, sort of get into the weeds with companies in the investing that we do on our fund. Through the ecosystem work that we do, we also get to pattern match and trend watch at an ecosystem level, having traveled now to 38 cities over the past 5 years through our Rise the Rest tours and spending months sort of in preparation with them. So when we get to know a city, I think in many ways, for me, a paradigm is that a city is like a startup itself. And so when we look at what's happening there, one, we assess sort of, I think, the level that we see a city in an ecosystem at. Is it an early stage company? Is it a growth stage company? Sort of like, where is it heading? And there are a lot of different factors, I think, that are at play, and it's always important for us to recognize that the sum total of a startup ecosystem in an innovation economy is not just the startups, the scale-ups, and the investors. It's the universities, it's the economic development folks, it's the corporations who have venture arms but also do a number of other things to get involved and support the ecosystems. It's state and local government. And so looking at the different levers that are pushed and pulled in different ways in different communities really has an impact on the growth opportunity of those companies. One interesting point, and I think a leading factor that we look towards, is to see what happens in cities when there's been a major liquidity event or capital event for what we think of as a tentpole company. So that might be Duo Security in Ann Arbor, which had a multi-billion-dollar exit. That might be Shipt in Birmingham, which had a $500 million exit to Target. It might be ExactTarget in Indianapolis, which had a multi-billion-dollar exit. It might be Pluralsight in Salt Lake City, which had a huge IPO recently, and watching what happens not just to the executives and the C-suite and what they do next, but if it was an M&A transaction, what the acquirer does. Do they pull all the talent out of the community, or do they reinvest and double down, not just in talent, but in infrastructure? What happens to the employees there? Was it a wealth creating event for them? And then do they reinvest in the community?
That last point is so critical. Was there a broad distribution of stock options? Mm-hmm. So you get the next generation of seed investors, entrepreneurs who can actually fund that next generation of companies. I don't want to call any companies or cities out, but some places have done better than others. And you see, like you mentioned Indianapolis with the ExactTarget. There's now a $100 million seed fund that's spun out of there. There's probably 6 enterprise software companies. That connection and that experience they got from Salesforce, taking it from 1,500 to 3,000 and making the commitment, is making a huge impact. And I'm going to take it over to Bozeman, which had their own example of this when Oracle bought Right Now Technologies and grew. It's a technical team there and grew it. So that's important around the ecosystem. But I would really love for you to talk about Blackmore.
Yeah,
the specific example, as we get into like AI and the future of technology and the opportunity for technical colleges like Montana State that might not hit the radar for the national conversation, but is doing impressive stuff that's impacting the overall economy.
And I think it's directly related to similar. I love Anna's analogy of like communities and ecosystems as being almost like startups or like founders. And similar to how founders, I think, are generally successful when they lever their unfair advantage, whether that's a hardship or history or passion, they lever their unfair advantage against every other founder out there. Cities and communities have these same unfair advantages that they need to lever. And a lot of people aren't even aware of them unless you're in those communities. It's like Bozeman, Montana. What do people think of? I don't know, mountains, buffalo.
Fishing,
there you go. What about photonics? What about optics? What about, the fact that the first laser crystal was grown in a lab in Montana State University? So there's tremendous cluster of research excellence. And one of our portfolio companies, Blackmore Sensors and Analytics, spun out of essentially IP and technology that was developed through that whole ecosystem. And arguably one of the most cutting edge sensors now in the autonomous driving vehicle space in little old Bozeman, Montana. So leveraging that unfair advantage is critical.
And it's grown from like 8 people to 50 or so people?
I think they're almost 90 now.
90 people.
From 8 to 90.
In a town of 60,000, somebody was saying,
all high-paying jobs.
And the one thing I know about Bozeman is their challenge. Somebody was talking about opportunity zones earlier. The challenge in Bozeman is actually technology workforce housing.
Yep, that's right.
Housing for people who make $80,000, $90,000 a year is actually a big challenge for growth. It's interesting. Each community has its own thing that they're faced with the challenge in their own economy. Charlie, one thing that we were talking about earlier was kind of that AI is going to be integrated into processes and the value of having local customers. It sounded like you had some portfolio company experiences, or was there something in here that maybe you can share with us what you had in mind there?
Yeah, totally. No, I think, we've spent a lot of time, obviously, AI is very important to Verizon strategically, given the amount of data we're transferring and analyzing both internally and externally for customers. What we've generally seen is that we think AI is sort of becoming a part of the stack, and that AI, there become fewer sort of AI companies, but become more verticalized companies that specialize in customer problems and use AI to address that problem, right? So one company that we've seen in the Heartland is a North Carolina company called Precision Hawk. It's a drone company that does mapping, analytics, will help improve safety so workers don't have to go up on utility lines or inspect pipelines as much, and take lots of pictorial images, use AI to construct GIS and other 3D models, and analyze where there might be problems that need folks to come out. So what's interesting about sort of the Heartland here in New York, we have manufacturing all around us, HVAC, Harley-Davidson, York, International, everything else, right? Hydropower. So there's a lot of folks who really know those verticals extremely well, and getting a B2B company that can scale well and get those first few contracts there can really do a lot better than folks. And that's really kind of the unfair advantage when you think about it. They know those customer niches very well and can address those. Then they can bring the other talent to scale and create global solutions.
So we have very limited time left, but since I think there are some entrepreneurs in the audience and we have investors up here, I would just, as we go down the line very quickly, just 10 seconds each, just one thing, maybe the non-obvious thing, because there's a lot of things, one thing that you would tell an entrepreneur who's coming to pitch you in a region, so not in Montana or in North Carolina or in one of the Rise of the Rest cities, what's one thing that you really need to hear from them that convince you to take the next step with them? Just one thing quickly down the road.
I would say tease me, don't tell me, and focus on the relationship. Focus on trying to build a relationship and want me to come back for more.
Thank you.
Would add to that, but also say, demonstrated product market fit for a company our size. We're typically sort of mid-stage, so but not exclusively, but typically. So that means, having some sense of ability to show how you can scale to an enterprise level. Not necessarily be there, but show how you can get there.
Just pick one. Okay. I think you have to really be able to clearly explain the business model. It's one thing to explain the vision, it's another thing to paint the picture, but really explaining how outsized vision beats a clean and simple product that gets delivered to market is an incredibly important sort of foundational element of any investment thesis. So I think that's the hook that then brings you back to learn more.
Well, thank you, and hope you all join me in thanking our wonderful panel. We'll be around. It was the past 20 minutes.